right? That's okay. Not a problem. So last week was a little crazy. We had these people here from England who were taking video, and you know it's a strange world. And some of you, I linked the little blog that they had, the little podcast that they had done. I mean, they're talking to people about psychedelics and all these kind of things. That's the kind of things that these guys are working on, and then they take video here. And then I have a new friend who is in Fresno who had a talk with Jordan Peterson this week about exploring Christianity, and they had, again, one of these little Patreon talks. And what's interesting is that so often when you talk to people about Christianity, so much of what things boil down to is this question of obedience and condemnation and obedience and salvation. That if being disobedient can get you condemned, can working the rules get you saved? And that's pretty much kind of an assumption we have on our part. If we're bad, we'll be punished, and if we're good, we'll be rewarded. And that's not a bad way to look at things. It's something we learn very much as children. And so then other questions come. If God can judge us for our failings, shouldn't he also reward us for our triumphs? And then the question, do we really need God, or can we rescue ourselves from our messes? And then the question, well, is there someplace, Pastor, you can point to me in the Bible to answer that question? The difficulty is that the Bible is a very long book and a very complicated book, and almost everything in the Bible is in the middle of conversations. And so people tend to look at certain passages and they say, oh, there's an answer. Then they look at other passages and then they're confused. And we've been going through the long story of the book of Kings. And we followed in the book of Samuel when Israel wanted a king. They had these judges, and then Saul was chosen. He didn't work out too well. Then David was chosen, and then David reigns, and then Solomon. And at the time of Solomon, when the temple was built, that's really, in a sense, kingdom come in terms of Israel. And then the book of Kings is this long, slow decline to corruption and decay. And that's really what the whole book of Kings is about. And we've been following it bit by bit by bit. And as you might imagine, when we get down here, we get down to the bottom. And that's about where we're at this week. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel, in Samaria. And he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Salmaneser's vassal, and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore Salmaneser seized him and put him in prison. And the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and marched against Samaria and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria, and he settled them in Hala, in Gozan on the Haber River, and in the towns of the Medes. Just those few verses, we have the end of a story. This entire sweep of the Bible that began back in Abraham had been building up to these God's chosen people and how God would reveal himself to the nations through that people. And then they went into Egypt, and then out of Egypt, and the desert wandering, and then into the promised land, and all of the problems in the Judges, and all of the problems in the book of Samuel, and then the book of Ruth, and all of this stuff that we've been talking about for years. It comes to an end of one lousy king who had seized power from someone else and basically had become the servant of the empire of Assyria and tried to get out by siding with Egypt, and Assyria said enough. And so what Assyria decided to do was come down, and they invaded, and they took Samaria, they didn't destroy it, and they took these cities that had belonged to the Philistines, and they kept coming down, and they had a battle with Egypt, because the thing to remember about Israel right here in the middle is that you always had the major empires of the Fertile Crescent up here, and you had Egypt down here. And so basically, for these major empires that always had the world's attention, this was a highway. These were little cow towns in the middle. And so the only time Israel very much got much of any freedom was when these empires were weak and dysfunctional themselves. And now Assyria finally had enough. They marched its troops down. And in the past, Assyria had done this basically to scare money out of these little cities. But this time Assyria came down and decided, here's an image of the king of Assyria, decided we're going to come to stay. And we're going to carve up this land into districts, and this will be part of our great Assyrian empire, which was over this part of the world, and Israel was no more. Now, if you look at this from the point of view of the empires, people might say, oh yeah, there was Israel, they had their little particular gods, and so on and so forth. But the irony is that if I say the kingdom of Israel, all of you have an idea in your head, but if I say the empire of Assyria, you say, huh? You have to be a Bible nerd to know anything about the empire of Assyria, but Israel, you have associations with that. Well, why? Well, because of the Bible. Now, what's interesting in this passage is that you just have a few verses that talk about the end of God's kingdom of Israel. And then you get a sermon in the book of Kings. And there isn't any grand thing. It's just kind of, it's gone. The people are spread about, and that's it. And you think, what's going on? Well, now for the sermon. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of Egypt, from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Remember, this is the long story. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all the towns. These were places where they could have their little individual spiritual practices. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. Turn away from all your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees, in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets. But they would not listen, and were stiff-necked as their ancestors. They did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees, and the covenants he had made with their ancestors, and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols, and themselves became worthless. That's the key verse right there. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, "Do not do as they do." They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts and they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore the Lord rejected all the peoples of Israel, and he afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. Then he tore Israel away from the house of David and made Jeroboam son of Nebat their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence. And he warned through all of his servants the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. When we read this story, a lot of people say, yeah, this is how the Bible goes. The Bible is the story of some ancient sky god. Some ancient sky god who makes up stories and tells scary stories to simple-minded people and to children to get them to obey archaic rules. That's what many think the Bible is. I wonder for a moment if we might pause and ask ourselves some questions. Now, the assumption of what I call common religion is just what I described earlier. If you do good, God will reward you. And if you do evil, God will punish you. And when we learn these things as children in Sunday school, and maybe we have a conscience, then we try to be really good. And then we do really good, and then we think, okay, I did really good. Now God is going to give me the things I want. It's a transaction. What often happens is we try to do good, we mess up a little bit, but in our own minds, well, we didn't mess up too much. At least I'm better than those other people. And then we sit there and wait, well, why doesn't God give me the things I want? Well, right away things start getting more complicated. How do you know which rules? Because, well, these are the rules that I think are important. There's these other rules in the Bible, but we kind of ignore them. Some people ignore these rules, and some people ignore those rules. This rule-based thing very much starts breaking down for a lot of people. This God of Israel also seems less reasonable than the other gods who are okay with people freelancing their spiritual portfolio on the high places. And this God of Israel gets rather intrusive about things we do with our body. And so many people today say, well, I'd like to be spiritual and not religious, because what I'd really like to be my guide is for my heart to sort of look around and say, well, I think this feels right to me, so I'll do this. And another person says, I think this feels right to me, and I'll do that. And maybe the really big things we can agree upon, like, well, don't kill other people and don't steal their stuff and don't be mean. But if you basically stay within those lines, you should have no problem with God. Now here's the funny thing about rules. There's really two kinds of rules. There's rules with natural consequences, and there's rules with external consequences. And most of the story I just articulated you basically are rules that we frame in our minds of external consequences. Rules of external consequences are, if Nina stands up and starts singing a solo in the middle of the sermon, I will walk down and I'll say, Nina, sit down. There's a rule of external consequences. The rule is, Nina may not sing solos in the middle of a sermon, and I will enforce it. Rules of natural consequences are, if you have a child in the house and you have a stove, you tell the child, don't touch the stove. And the child might see that, if you have an electric stove, that pretty red glowing thing and think, oh, that looks good. And the child starts to reach out the hand, and the mother says, don't touch the stove. The child reaches out again, and the mother gives the hand a little slap. Don't touch the stove. Now maybe, if the child is really stubborn and not listening to the mother will hold back a little bit, and the child will reach out and, ow! Well, that's the difference between external and natural consequences. You see, in the story of the child and the stove, there's both kinds of things going on. And the question is, a lot of people recognize natural consequences, not consequences, and say, that's the only kind that should apply. But here's the difficulty about human beings. When we do what's natural, and we keep doing what's natural, and we don't listen to anyone else, well, then you get to be about 50 years old, and you go to the doctor, and you've gained about 40, 50 pounds. Then when you're 18 years old, and you've always eaten what you want, and the doctor takes your blood pressure and says, oh, this is kind of high. Yeah. The doctor then looks at your cholesterol level and says, oh, this number's kind of high. Yeah. So then the doctor says, okay, I want you to go on a diet, and I want you to exercise, and I want you to stop eating these things. And you say, I don't care what that old doctor says. What happens then? Maybe nothing. Maybe you just keep going on. Maybe you just keep doing what you want to do. Well, here's the funny thing about natural consequences. We don't always know when they come. Here's a question I want you to ponder in this story. When did Israel stop being Israel? What was it that made Israel special? See, devotion to their particular God and his strange demands that permeated all of life was what made Israel special. And all of these stories we've been reading have basically been one tiny step after another. That's essentially what corruption is. Of being less Israel and less listening to God. And again and again and again and again. And this happened over long periods of time. Now, one of the things I often hear in these debates that are going on with a number of atheists, or they say, well, what I can't tolerate is that you have a book that doesn't change, and how we're supposed to read that book that doesn't change. Why are we supposed to be bound to standards that are thousands of years old? I think, well, that's interesting. Here's the thing. How do I know whether I weigh more than I did when I was 20 years old? A scale. Well, what is a scale? It's a measurement. Does a pound mean the same thing as it did in 1980? So if I step on the scale and the scale says 225, but when I stepped on the scale in 1980 and it said 185, is that useful information? What if I decide, you know what, I want the kind of scale that when I step on it, it always says 185. You say, well, yeah, that's a scale you might like, but that's not the scale you need. You need a different scale. You need the scale to speak the truth to you about yourself. And some of these things don't change. So the book of Kings is about Israel simply becoming like all of her neighbors. They have the same gods as all of her neighbors. They have the same behaviors, kiss up and kick down, as all of their neighbors. And they have the same goals as all of their neighbors. And so what happens in this story is they just become like all of their neighbors. They just take God off the title and they become like everyone else. So the Assyrians swoop in and they take the other peoples that they had conquered and they bring them and they install them in Samaria. And then they take the people of Israel and they just locate them in other places. And off they go. Dissipating. No longer who they were. What does it mean to be Israel? Well, here's the question. Would the outcome have been different if they had been obedient? Well, yes and no. If they had been obedient and they had been exiled, guess what would have happened in all of these places? They would have been different in all of these places. Now, as the story goes on, when the southern kingdom gets exiled and we get into the prophets, that's going to be the question. When I get to Babylon, what am I going to do? Am I going to be like the Babylonians, or am I still going to be Israel in Babylon? And now we all know this where we go, because if you get a job and you go into that job and you realize that job has a culture. And that culture has implications for life. And suddenly you have to decide, am I going to fit in? I want to fit in. But what if they are all doing something that I think is wrong? How is that going to go? You see, part of us wants to say yes. Because if you read the book of Deuteronomy, God says, if you follow my covenant, then I will bless you. And you think, well, that sounds good. But there's a problem with this. Because every time when we read the book and God says, if you do this, I will bless you, a problem develops. And it's usually a problem on our side of the line. When God says, do this, sometimes we try. Sometimes we do it a little bit, but we usually don't do it right, and we usually don't do it fully. And so then we wonder about the original question that we started with. If we get punished for doing bad things, can't we clean up our own lives by following the rules, by doing good things? Now, generally speaking, doing good things is a good thing. But what if there was a case where there was a perfect man who not only obeyed all of the covenant, but lived it out perfectly? Surely, if someone was a perfect man and obeyed the covenant perfectly and lived it out perfectly, then that person would be what? Well, everyone would love that person, right? And everyone would say, oh, that's the kind of person I want to be, because that is the ideal person. We think that when we think about what if really obeying and complying and following, not just the letter of the law, but the letter and the spirit of the law, all the way down, that would achieve an excellence, and there's no telling what would happen to that person. Maybe they'd want to make him king. Now, it's interesting that even Plato, writing not a few hundred years, about 400 years after these events that we're talking about today, made the observation in his Republic that if there's a just man who is rewarded for being a just man, and there's a just man who is being punished for being a just man, and everyone thinks him unjust, the second man is actually more just. Because the first one is being rewarded by doing good. So if I do good in front of all of you, and all of you say, yeah, we like Paul, he does good, I'm getting rewarded for doing good. But what if I do good and everyone around you says, we don't like Paul. Paul does bad things. But I keep doing good. Well, the second case, the goodness is better, ironically. Now, if such a man lived, how would he be received? Would we make him king? Would we welcome him and appreciate him? Now, remember back on the playground when you were playing with the kids and there was something you were told you weren't supposed to do, but you were all doing it anyway? Maybe like in Eastern Christian where I went to school, the kids would sneak out to the gas station across the street from school and they'd have their smokes there. And they knew they weren't supposed to smoke, but hey, it was the 70s and 80s, so you sneak out and you have your smokes. What if one kid went out there and didn't smoke? What's the pressure? Why don't you smoke too? This is how we do it, isn't it? If one person, we have names. What are we? Goody Two Shoes. It's an old name that was used. If one person is doing right and everyone else is compromising, the whole group gets unhappy. Now, in the first century, the Judean culture war went kind of like this. The Romans and the Greeks thought that the Jews were ignorant, backward people. Because everybody knew the Roman way of life was the best way of life. Because everybody knew the Romans were on top. Because everybody knew the Romans had the money and the technology and the politics and the best gods and the best temples. The Roman way of life was the best way of life, but those darn Jews keep up with their strange religion and their isolation from everyone else, so nobody really liked them. So when the Romans came down into Judea, they had the Greek man's burden to try to civilize the Jews with gymnasiums and races and temples to Apollo and all of these wonderful things. They keep trying to give the Jews keep trying to improve them. But the Jews resisted. Now the Jews thought the opposite. The Jews hated that they thought what they considered the gymnasium and all these Roman things. These were cultural contaminations. These were paganism. And so they tried to resist it. And so the relationships were never very good. And this was going on for hundreds of years within that area of time and within that countryside. All parties hated and despised each other. But in 30 AD, all of those warring parties that couldn't agree on what the best way to living was, could agree that they thought the world would be better if Jesus was dead. Now that should strike us as strange, because if you ask someone, almost anyone today, who is Jesus? Yeah, Jesus is a good guy. Jesus is a moral teacher. Yeah, Jesus is a great guy. If Jesus were alive today, which he still is, but if Jesus were ministering like he did back in the first century, odds are, well, what would we think of him? He'd be stubborn in ways we'd want him to be flexible, and he'd be flexible in ways we'd want him to be stubborn. Because that's exactly what happened in the first century. And people who couldn't agree on anything could agree that he should die. And so they killed him. You see, we all know that doing evil can get you condemned. But what does obedience get you? Do you know how to be obedient? Do you know what obedience is for? Even Pilate says what is true. Perfection and obedience will in fact get you dead, hated by the perpetual warring factions of the human race. That's what we should see in Jesus' life. But what if God is a judge who judges rightly and vindicates? What would he do with a perfect person? Well, what's the story of Jesus say? He raises him from the dead. And if you read Philippians 2 that we read last week, he raises him to the highest place. This is exactly what we think should happen to a perfect person. But any perfect person in our midst would irritate us. So what should that show us about us? We fall short. So if God gives us the rules and we can't keep them, what are we to do? I've long since blown perfection. In fact, I can't even hit my own standards of what I should do, because I'm more than willing and able to tell other people how to live. But I can't even live by the standards I want to give other people, which means that at the end of my life, God calls me up and says, give an account for your life. And he said, you know, that smartphone you were carrying around, I put a little app on it when you weren't looking. And every time you said, well, I think he or she should do this, I think he or she should do that, I recorded it. Let's play the app. I'm not even going to judge you by my standards. I'm going to judge you by your own standards, and let's see if you even met that standard. And I know I wouldn't. Then what do I say to God? I've messed up my life in ways I can't clean up. I need forgiveness and mercy. And what's more, I'm a bad bet, just like the lost northern kingdom. When I get into a group, all I want to do is fit in and have people like me and be received and applauded. That's all the northern kingdom wanted. What if I could be united to this perfect man? Well, how? Well, Romans 6 says, through baptism. What if his goodness was so good, it could somehow be given to me? Well, that would be amazing. But would I want it? There's the rub. I need a new heart. If it would be a gift, it'd have to be a gift, because otherwise, if I bought it, well, I don't have anything to buy it with. Those of you who know the Heidelberg Catechism basically know I'm running through the entire Heidelberg Catechism this morning. That is the argument of the document. This is our predicament. This is the gospel. Now, having received this gift, how should you live? We have a TV show, I don't know, is it still on, American Idol? The idea behind that show is when we see someone or something that has qualities that we admire, we want to be like them. We want to please them. So there's this old Jordan Peterson thing going on right now, and everybody wants to get close to this man, and everybody wants to be his friend, and everybody wants to talk to him, and blah, 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 blah. What's going on there? It's just a psychological thing. When there's something you esteem and admire, you want to be like it. Well, what about this perfect man? What if you meet this perfect man? What if you know this perfect man? What if you can have a relationship with this perfect man? So it's interesting, my friend from Fresno, he grew up in the church and his father was a missionary and all these things went on, and I was talking to him about his story, and he gets to a point in his story and he said that one day it dawned on me, Jesus knows me. Jesus wants to be my friend. And he said, that changed my life. How could this man want to know me? What then happens naturally? I want to live up to him. I want to be like him. I want to emulate him. Now, is all of that emulation earning anything? No. Because it's gratitude for what he's already done. Let's pray. Lord, for the most part, we are focused on ourselves. We are easily distracted. And we are quite judgmental of each other, biasing our own desires and behaviors. And to actually believe this of ourselves is disturbing and alarming to such a degree that we usually try to push it away. And then we cast ourselves in a situation where we imagine you are greatly pleased with us. And most of this is a delusion. And in fact, what we need is to see your Son. And on one hand, your Son shows us all of the ways that we fall short. The people we truly are. But bit by his Spirit, we begin to see his goodness. We begin to understand his perfection. We begin to realize how the decisions of his life impact ours and what that should do for our view of the world. Lord, we can't do this by ourselves. We can't even obey the standards we try to hold other people to. We need someone to come and rescue us. We need someone to give us a new heart. We need someone to change us from the inside out. And even so, you pull us along reluctantly. Forgive our resistance. Help us to become like you, even if it hurts. Hear our prayer. In the name of Jesus, amen. Would you stand?